reminder of your goodness and reminder, Father, of how you take care of us. We pray, Father, that you bless us as we study together and consider the judgeship of Deborah and just what that means to us in our time. And it's through Jesus we pray, amen. I need to do one thing here. I think I'm going to try to stream this again. So I upgraded my computer and I messed up all my settings. So hang on one second. Let's see if I can knock something out right quick. And if I can't, I'll do it later. Okay. All right. Judges, anybody remember? Well, you do because you were here Monday. So you're a glutton for punishment. You've come back. Just a reminder, kind of the theme of what we've been looking at. If you're here for the first time, so I started teaching Judges backwards from the end. So I did chapter 17 through 21 first to kind of lay the groundwork of what's going on in culture and society and the mindset of the people, and then started at the front in chapter 1 looking at the judges. So the big thing is everybody does what's right in their own eyes, and that it was more important than we. And if I wanted to do it, I just did it, and that's kind of how it was. And that was morality, religion, business, ethic, whatever. That's how it was. So that's kind of the overarching theme we've looked at with the people, and then we've looked at that pattern that happens. Evil is embraced and gone after. God's anger is aroused. God's grace comes to the forefront through a deliverer or a judge, which mostly is a warrior, except for Deborah, kinda. And then there's peace and rest, and then the cycle repeats, and it starts all over again. And so you have 12 judges in Judges, and 3 of those are or 4 are relatively minor, and one's a weird judge, Abimelech. Well, they're all weird, but he's weirder than the rest. And one's really a judge, and that's Deborah. She's the only one that's really a judge. As we think about what that term means. And so she's my favorite to study. It's full of really cool stuff and intrigue. And so and Deborah's judgeship is found in 2 chapters. And that's in chapters 4 and 5. So at the end of chapter 3, Ehud had defeated Eglon of Moab, and the land was at rest for 80 years. Rest means there's nobody bothering you. In that kind of rest, it's a rather non-chaotic society. And then what happened is Ehud dies, and guess what? Israel goes chasing after other gods, and things happen, and God gets upset, and so God goes and hires him a oppressor. And so I think the best way to think about the judgeship of Deborah is to take it 2 weeks, is to not just introduce you all the characters, and then next week we'll really go through the plot line and what it means, what Deborah means. But the characters are fun and they're interesting. So Deborah, you want to know who the players are. I hate those movies that are really good movies and win Academy Awards, and you're trying to figure out the character and you don't figure it out to the last 10 minutes of the show, which is really good because that's inductive methodology, which I really appreciate. But I'm not going to do that to you with Deborah because there's a lot of players, and there's really a lot of unique literary technique in Deborah that's not in the other stories too. So that has to do with the players. So God hires a king of a place called Hazor, or as we say in East Texas, Hazor. But since I have to try to pronounce it right, and his name is Jabin, even though it's with a B. So it's interesting. Hazor is one of the cities that when Joshua made the conquest of Canaan, Hazor was one of the cities that was designated to be a whole burnt offering to God. In other words, burn the whole thing up. Nothing lives. People, animals, plants, buildings, gone. There were 3 cities in the book of Joshua that happened: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. It's interesting to me that Hazor is rebuilt in some form or fashion, or took that name on, because it has, for the Jewish people, when a king comes up from Hazor, he has risen up from the ashes. It doesn't set well with their society, because God's already defeated that place once, and here they're back. So it's interesting that this guy's name, Jabin, means that he will understand. So there's some things, and we'll unpack the understanding part a little bit more next week. But that's what his name means. He will understand. And, what will he understand? How to oppress the Jews, what God's all about, who God really is, who he is. So Jabin's a minor character in the literary story. He's a major player in the story because he's the one who oppresses Israel. And the oppression, so Eglon's oppression in Ehud was about money, taxes, tariffs, economic pressure. This is not. This is about cruelty. You know what? I'm walking down the street. I don't like you. I'll just take you out. Right? If I like your horse, I'll just take your horse. If I don't like your house, I'll just bulldoze it down. If I don't like you, I'll just eliminate you. So he's cruel. He does things by force. He's got an army, so he's got military backing to do what he does. But keep in mind, as we go through the story of Deborah, what his name implies is God's going to make him understand something. Okay, you got to figure out what that something is in the story. It is certainly more implicit than explicit in the story. So that's character number 1. He's the king that God hires to oppress God's people. Go shut those doors for just a minute. You better grab it. Not that, I don't enjoy hearing children, because I do. They mean life, but I can't hear myself. So so if you're playing on the depth chart, Jabin is the king of Hazor, or the Canaanite king, who's going to do the oppressing. So he's God, who God hires. Jabin has a commander of his army, and the commander's name is Sisera. He's the agent of cruelty. Don't know what his name means. It's a non-Semitic name. And so, but we do know this. He's from a weird place. Let me see if I can find the verse where his hometown is. It's about 37 letters long. It's in verse 2. Haroshet HaGoyim. That is where he's from is the forest of the people. And the Goyim are the people who aren't Israelites, the Gentile people. I do wonder, and I talked to the Monday class about this, if he's from there, if he controls the wood supply in Israel, and Jabin, the king, controls the horses and the chariots, they got him a pretty good system going right now. They can do some economic damage as well as other damage. And if they come tear your house down and you need wood to build it, and he's from the wood place, you got to go through him to get it. God's pretty smart. By the way, if God decides to oppress you, God will oppress you in a lot of different ways. Maybe there's a warning there. He's the agent of cruelty. So, like a good king, Jabin just sits back and says, "Hey, go take care of them. Bring me the spoil of war, and be as mean as you want to be. There's no accountability here. There's no rules of engagement. Just go do what you need to go do. So that's part of what his gig is to go be cruel. And he does that pretty well. So there's 900 chariots, which means he's got an army that is really almost invincible. Remember that the Israelite people in this period of time have very little weapons. Iron's been taken away from them. They're using plows and clubs and sticks to fight. And so you got a chariot, an army full of chariots. It's kind of like the Israelites in Pharaoh when they left Egypt. You're going to lose, right? If you fight conventionally or you try to do it by yourself, you're in a bad way. So he's the commander of the chariots. If you want to put good guys and bad guys, so on the bad guy list, right, we got the king of Hazor, and we got the commander who lives in the forest on the bad side of the ledger. On the good side of the ledger, then our next character is Deborah. Deborah's name means bee, like the buzzing, like the insect bee, like she will sting you. So you might remember when God was leading Israel out of Egypt and getting them ready to go into Canaan, he says, "I will be like a hornet to your enemies. Just let me go fight for you. I'll sting them." So Deborah's a stinger in her own way. But I think the more important thing about Deborah, and in the Hebrew, her name is not Deborah, it's Deborah. And so every Hebrew word is a three-letter root word. So Hebrew's a fascinating language. So DVR is the three-letter root word of Deborah. It's also the three-letter root word of word and speak. In other words, Deborah is the one who speaks. Would be the one who speaks, which is interesting because of what she's called. So she stings a bit, and she speaks on behalf of God because she's called a prophetess. So in Hebrew, the word navi, which is prophet, simply means one who speaks for God, right? And one who understands the will of God and reveals the will of God to other people. Prophets are really misunderstood. So when I say the word prophet, what do you typically think about? Listen, Israel understood them of what that they do. We don't understand them.
You have John the Baptist, and you got Jeremiah.
Yeah. So you got crazy people, right, who are speaking nonsense, who are usually trying to predict something, right? And actually, that's really kind of an unfair caricature of a prophet. Prophets are probably the sanest people in the whole society, and they're not really about predicting as much as they are about just telling you how it is. One of my professors at Austin Grad, the Hebrew professor, he says that prophecy is more about forthtelling than foretelling, and I believe that to be true. And so that part I think is really important when we begin to think about what a prophet does. They tell you how it is, and it's not always pleasant for them, but they speak God's truth and they speak God's word into your society, and it has an application of the here and now, not just about hundreds of years down the road. So Deborah's called one who speaks for God. Something else interesting about Deborah that I want you to look at that has got some translators a bit perplexed. She is called the wife of Lapidot. There's another way to read that. The word wife and the word woman are the same word in Hebrew. And lapidot means torch or light. And so some of the Hebrews people, especially rabbis, thought she was the torch lady, right? The lady who brought light, which would certainly fit her prophetic character, right? She reveals the light of God, reveals the will of God. And so I tend to lean that way. It's, I might be in the minority, but it certainly seems to fit what she's about and what her character is about, and how she's recognized in Israel. And so she's also one who judges. So she sits under a palm tree somewhere between Ephraim and Benjamin on the border, and she brings out wisdom, right? And she provides justice to the people. She has a good reputation. People come to her with, hey, we've got this issue, and it could be a social issue, it could be a legal issue. But the idea of justice and judging is not about, it's not negative always. We tend to put this negative connotation on that word. But really it's about just processing and thinking and decision making. And so what Deborah does is she listens and directs and guides and offers advice and rules on law, in some regard probably as well. But I think what she really does is provide justice for the people who felt that they had been wronged or are seeking some kind of solution to a problem. And so God raises her up. This, by the way, this is the only time in a judge that we don't get that language. So in the other judges, the oppression comes, so God raises up a deliverer. God's already got one. She's in place. So the oppression's gone on for 20 years. And so she's there. She's known. She's respected. And I think she's seen as one who speaks on behalf of God, which really is super important, I think, to the story. Because in addition to all those things, Deborah is a symbol of the presence of God. So there's in chapter 5, so when we get to the way the chapters are set up, chapter 4 is the narrative story. Chapter 5 is the poem about the narrative story. Chapter 5 was actually probably written before chapter 4. It's older Hebrew. And so in chapter 5, there is this picture of God showing up in what's called a theophany, that God shows up in a flood. But in chapter 4, God shows up in Deborah. So I think you get some complementary filling in the gaps between the two chapters in the story of Deborah. So, all right, symbol of God, provider of justice, spokesperson for God, lady who lights the way, one who stings you. She's well-rounded. All right, thoughts on, so she's the first ledger on the good guy side, right? It's Deborah. All right, I'm just going on. Any stop me if you want to ask about people, and I'll try to fill in the gaps a little bit. But I'm not going to give the story away. I don't want to tell you who wins. Don't read ahead. No, it's fine. Okay. That's what I like. Crickets chirping. Yes, sir. Yeah, so that's I think that's really an interesting concept. How does she get into the position that she gets, right? Because we don't get the exact language that we get with other judges, right? God raises someone up and sends them out to fight the bad guys. And so to me, she's there, right? She's been doing this for a while. Yes, I would say that God does appoint her, but it's not in the same way that he appoints the warriors, at least not in the language of that. And so in chapter 5, she's called a mother of Israel. And to me, that means that's one who's been there and nurtured people and has some understanding. And there is I think there's a little bit in chapter 5 that would lend itself to God appointing her in this poetic language that's there, because see if in verse 6 of chapter 5, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased and travelers kept to the byways. The peasantry prospered in Israel, grew fat on the plunder, because you arose, Deborah. So you got that language as a mother in Israel. So it doesn't say that specifically that God raised her up, but I would say yes. That's an implication. So so it's unique, right? She's unique. She's a female judge. She's the only female judge in Judges. She's a ruler in Israel. And so her story is, I think, is one of those stellar stories we need to lean back into when we think about gender, and we think about how God uses different folks in our community, and not just put people in boxes, right? And so, and I'll unpack that a little bit more next week in the story. But she's an incredible character study in the Old Testament. So,
but it wasn't like God hadn't used women before. She wasn't.
Right? No, she's not. Oh yeah, women have been involved in God's plan from the get-go, right? And in the ministry of God, and in carrying out the will of God. So it's, I mean, they don't, listen, Israel doesn't push back at her, right? They accept her. And as one who really does speak on behalf of God, and speaks wisdom and speaks justice. And so, which is interesting for a very patriarchal society to recognize this woman. It's not only interesting, it's quite refreshing, actually, to read when we come across. So, I mean, we read others, right? There's another great character that in the period of the Judges that is not a judge and is not a warrior, but is integrally important to the Messiah, and that's Ruth, right? Her story takes place in the period of Judges as well, and so she keeps the messianic hope alive, right, in her own way, and she's a foreigner on top of all that, right? So,
and she even speaks into that when Barak says, "I won't go if you won't go."
right.
She says, "Well, I'll certainly go with you, but this road won't lead to your glory,
Yeah.
because it'll be a woman who."
Yeah, Jael.
So I don't know much about history, but were all of the surrounding Canaanite communities, were they patriarchal as well?
Yeah, I'd say primarily. Now, they've got goddesses, right? So, Asherah and some others. So there's female gods that are certainly part of the Canaanite culture. But yeah, it's still going to be, I think, very patriarchal and, misogynistic in its own way. Yeah, that's the culture, right? That's how it was. Okay, so we got two bad guys against one good woman. The bad guys don't stand a chance, right? But just to make it more fun, let me get to the next character, and that is Barak. Barak, his name means lightning, which is interesting because it's a storm that helps them win. But just like Deborah, has this name, has this three-word root, so does Barak, which we get the word barakah, which is blessing from. And but his name means lightning. So just like Jabin has a commander, Deborah's got one. So now it's 2-2, right? You got king and prophetess, commander and commander. When you're filling out your ledger sheet of good guys and bad guys. So he's the commander of Israel's army. Here's what he doesn't have. He doesn't have horses, and he doesn't have chariots, and he doesn't have many weapons of iron, if any. But you know what he's got? He's got a lot of confidence in this woman named Deborah. And a lot of confidence in her wisdom. So as Mark pointed out, it's time to go to battle. She, gets on the phone and calls Commander Barak and said, "Hey, come on. We got to rally some troops." And Barak needs a little assurance. I don't want to go. Right? I'm not going. As a matter of fact, I'm not going unless you go fight with us. So Deborah says, okay. So that's when I said she's the presence of God. So remember, when Israel goes to war, what do? They carry the ark out in front of them. When they leave Egypt, you got the pillar of fire and cloud. You got this manifestation of God, right? God's presence is there. Deborah takes that role on, I think, in this battle with Barak. And here's one thing I like about Barak. You know what? Deborah tells him exactly what Mark said. Hey, I'll go with you, but you know what? We're not putting your name in the wall of honor. You're going to win, but you're not going to get the credit. And you know what? To Barak's credit, okay. I don't care about getting the credit, right? The victory is worth more than the honor. Again, that's refreshing, isn't it? So I heard an interview today with this is how sports talk and theology always come into play, somehow, with a guy who's a running back for Oregon State, who's going into the NFL draft. And he had a phenomenal season last year, but his team didn't. And it was nice to hear him say, you know what? It was really nice to to get some yards and break some records. I'd have much rather the team won. That's probably easy to say because he's going to be a high, draft pick and make plenty of money. But I think he meant it, right? It's not about credit and honor. It's about, the end results here. Now, I will say, and this is one of the things I will want to unpack next week, it's one of my greatest heartburns in ministry is people getting territorial and wanting some credit. Just hang on to that. We'll talk about it next week. But including myself, right? Get my name in the paper. Or whatever that is. So, but I think to his credit, his trust is in Deborah, and his hope is not in himself and his own abilities. I mean, the odds are he's not going to win. Just if you put it on paper, right? Bad guys are way stronger than good guys here. This is another David and Goliath story, right? Which hadn't happened yet. Maybe it's a foreshadowing of a David and Goliath story. It's not looking good until we meet the next character, who I can't decide if she's on the good ledger or the bad ledger. She's somewhere in between. She's a double agent, maybe. And that is Jael. And again, if you're from East Texas, it's Jael. But Jael, she's the woman who's going to get the credit here for some victory. She is, and I will say this, and again, we'll unpack it more next week. She is a potential victim. She's a female who's put herself at risk with a very snarky commander of a very snarky king, who, if history is and what's been reported about the people in that time, part of the plunder of war was females. I see a woman, I take a woman. Right? She is related to Moses' family. She is this is her. She is married to someone who's in the lineages of Moses' in-laws, and Heber the Kenite, and so she's got some kind of affiliation with Israel through family, but her husband is chummy with the king of Hazor, so they're playing both sides a little bit, maybe. They're nomadic. They live in tents. They're traveling around. This is probably taking place at Megiddo, the Valley of Megiddo, which is the base of Mount Carmel. It's where one of these battles may take place. Not sure. So, but they're nomadic. So, yeah, we're Tabor. So, yeah, I need to get a map out. So where the actual battle takes place is a little bit in question. Is Tabor another name for Carmel, or is it a different mountain? And it's, I mean, there's certainly a different mountain named Tabor. So, we'll look at some of that next week on kind of the where. I may, if I can, I may stick a map up here and let us look at it to get a little bit of an idea of geography. The thing about geography in the Old Testament is those names change and get assigned. Like Hazor may not be Hazor, right? The one that happened in Joshua could be a renaming of a place. Yeah. Which, yes, it's destroyed, right? So it takes on the name. Names are hard, in geography is hard in Hebrew in the Old Testament. So, but I'll talk, maybe if I think about it, I'll get a map. We'll throw it up there. So look at where the battle takes place. But Jael she is not only a potential victim in this war. She's affiliated with both parties in the war. But what she's the clever warrior of the story, right? Where Ehud was the crafty spy who goes back into, Eglon's palace and stabs him and runs away, and Shamgar's got his magic stick, his ox goad, and does his thing. She's the warrior in this that really kind of gets the credit for the battle. But she is, because of what transpires as the battle carries on. I think she is a potential victim, and so we'll talk about hospitality and cultural norms some next week with her and Sisera especially. One more character. So you got two bad guys on one side and two good guys on the other side, and you got this warrior kind of in the middle, and you're not really sure whose side she's on, but her own, maybe. But she becomes an agent for Yahweh, who is he's the tipping point character now in the story. I don't think I got to this Monday when we were talking. So. Yeah, I'm a little perplexed at her role. And I've read this through a bunch of times. What is she really about? Has she taken a side, or did she just take a moment here? I do think, and I'll go ahead and explore this some. I do think part of what she does, it may be self-defense, because there's some language when Sisera comes into her tent that would imply he's not just drinking milk and taking a nap. So there could be some assault in there, or potential for assault.
She wasn't a seductress.
I think she could, potentially a victim. I think, right? There's others people that would think they're on your line, that, right? She gives him the milk and lures him to sleep. And I do want to unpack that a little bit as we look at the text next week about what she does inside the tent, right? Unlike Las Vegas, what happened in her tent didn't stay inside her tent, right? We get the story. And so Yahweh is the next player. It's interesting. Yahweh's role in Judges is always interesting. Yahweh is the oppressor, and Yahweh is the deliverer at the same time. Right? And so Yahweh uses these Canaanites to oppress, and then Yahweh uses a collection of misfits to deliver for the most part, right? Deborah's not a misfit, but they just are unlikely deliverers. By the way, I think all this sets up the unlikeliness of a Messiah from Galilee. Because remember what Philip said when he first met Jesus. What good comes out of Nazareth, right? Yeah. you know what? You're just a carpenter's boy. That's what you are. So God's the next character, and God's the one then who tips the scale. Right. Using these people, right, all of them actually, probably the overconfidence of a commander of an army of chariots against an army of people who are basically non-weaponized, and led by a woman, no less, in his world. And so you got his overconfidence maybe playing into this, and you've got Deborah's supreme confidence in God playing into this, and you've got Barak's supreme confidence in Deborah's supreme confidence in God playing into this. And then you got Jael, who just does her thing, right? That's there. So there's your roll call of characters. There's some natural occurrences that come into the story that we'll read about in chapter 5 in the Song of Deborah and Barak, and there's just some interesting things that happen as the story unpacks and unfolds. That you go, all right, you read it and go, So I think what we'll do next week, I know it's long, but we may just read the song first and just read it in full. And maybe, because I think what the song does, the song really tells the story, and the prose of the narrative in chapter 4 fills in the gaps of who the people are and kind of things that had happened with the narrative story. They're a great complement to each other, but you got to read both of them together to kind of get the full picture of what happens. Chapter 4 is really sketchy on details about some things. In chapter 5, you've got to unpack the poetry a little bit to get to what's going on in chapter 4. And so I'll want to do that. And then we need to think about, just some things we need to think about. What's Deborah's ultimate role in this? What's Barak's ultimate role in this? What's Jael's ultimate role in this? What's Yahweh's ultimate role in this? And then I want to look at some of the nuances of the culture with the gender issue, with the women getting the glory here and being the stars of the story, and also what's going on in the tent and what's going on with Heber and Jabin and Jael and Israel, and to look at that, and then maybe talk a little bit more about how all this fits into our time in place in our culture. There's some cultural faux pas that happen here in this story that are outside the scope of their normal cultural expectation, and how God uses those. And God does use those. And then I think there's a really good lesson about ministry here too, and about leading ministries and being involved in ministry in the story of Deborah that I'll share with you next week. So I've talked for 44 minutes, so now it's your turn if you got questions about any of that. I don't want to spoil the ending. I couldn't do this in a week. There's too much in it. So we'll really unpack the text some next week and look at the song. It's fantastic work, and there's a lot of clever wordplay, I think, going on. It's a really neat literary piece too in Judges. It's my favorite. I told you when I started this, I like Judges because I'm a junior high boy at heart, and so this has a little bit of junior high boy stuff in it, and I'll go back over those things that are in Judges, like humor, albeit dark, and it's got those kind of things next week. But this is the most cleverly told of the judges' stories. Deborah is, and I think the characters are really unique, and how their names play into some things, and so it's a good piece of literature as well as a good story, and a good narrative, and ultimately it's a story about God, which all the judges' stories ultimately become a story about God, and it's really it's a incredible story of that. Okay.
I find it fascinating that all of the exciting things in history that are worth recording there's a song about them.
Yeah.
All the way from the very beginning. We talk about Moses' song, but we've lost. The tune doesn't necessarily make it through history.
Right.
But the ballad itself makes it through.
Yeah, so there's great little snippets of songs all through the prophets, right? And Isaiah get the song of the vineyard, and which is really a great piece of literary work, and definitely get the song of Miriam's song after the crossing of the sea, and you get that. We do get that kind of weird allusion to the new song of Moses and the Lamb in Revelation, and whatever that is. I know what it sounds like when we sing it, but right, we'll sing in heaven the new song, and so yeah. But the songs, the poetry in the Old Testament is really powerful, and it's highly descriptive, but it's also evocative. It pulls emotions and paints things in a really unique picture. So, and sometimes I don't think we appreciate it. I know I don't appreciate it sometimes. So, okay, what else you want to talk about tonight? I'm willing to let you have the floor. So.
Why do you suppose back in the Old Testament we see God using women? New Testament he says women remain silent. Why is there such?
Yeah, well, one is we misunderstood what that word silent means, so which is a Greek word study, but and then two, it's context of where those things and how they're written and that need to be unpacked. So, God's always used women, and there's been prophetesses throughout. Even Paul, who writes those words in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy and other places, listens to prophetesses before he goes into Jerusalem, and he decides not to heed their advice, right? And Agabus's daughters, and so I think they've been there, Bob. I think that throughout, it's just how we've learned to read text and understand text and what it means and how it's applied that we've missed some of the beauty of it, and missed some of what God's doing in that. And that's true of a lot of things, not just gender, but a lot of things. Yeah, I do think it's interesting to reflect on that and what's going on in the New Testament writers, especially in Paul. Yeah, so.
Kind of makes you wonder how many things, if we got something like that, potentially wrong, how many other things that we could potentially get wrong.
Yeah, that we've just looked or I think that's part of trying to let the Bible interpret us as much as we try to interpret it, and to look at some bigger, a little bit broader view of things, and take the whole of Scripture, and not just a verse or here or there, but take the whole of it is super important. And that's anything, any kind of exegetical study. It's easy for me to take 6 verses and unpack it and come up with something, but it may not fit the whole of Scripture, right? And so I think we have to do that. All right. I think